Rancher sat alone with a hungry baby after his wife passed, until she knocked with full breasts. The wind howled outside the wooden cabin, carrying with it the taste of winter and sorrow. Inside, the fire flickered low, its light casting trembling shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Samuel sat in the rocking chair, his arms wrapped around the tiny, crying bundle that was his only remaining piece of her, his wife, Mary. She had been gone just 3 nights, taken by fever so suddenly that his heart hadn't caught up to the silence she left behind. Now, all that silence was filled by the sharp, desperate cries of his newborn son. Samuel tried everything: warming milk, whispering lullabies, pressing the child close to his chest as if his heartbeat could feed him. But the baby's wails only grew weaker, thinner, as hunger clawed through its small body. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. He sat there, watching the flames rise and fall like a dying heartbeat, feeling the edges of despair closing in. Outside, the snow thickened, draping the ranch in white sorrow. The horse stood restless in the stable, the cattle quiet under the heavy storm. Samuel knew he couldn't make the journey to town, 20 miles through snow, too far for a newborn and a man whose soul already hung by a thread. He whispered Mary's name over and over, like a prayer that might bring her back. But prayers, he'd learned, didn't answer the way you wanted. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, so soft he thought the wind was playing tricks. But then it came again, steady, human, and desperate. He rose, clutching the baby close, and opened the door to find a woman standing there, her hair wet from the snow, her dress clinging to her body, her breath visible in the icy air. She looked half frozen, half mad, her eyes wide and glistening with something between fear and pleading. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. I heard the baby crying." Samuel's throat closed. He didn't know how she'd heard anything through the storm, or what fate had brought her here. She was shivering, her lips pale, her clothes soaked. And yet, even through the exhaustion etched on her face, he saw a strange strength, a glow of life in a place where his world had gone cold. He stepped aside, and she entered. The firelight touched her skin, warming the color back into her cheeks. She looked at the baby, then at Samuel. "He's hungry," she said softly, her voice breaking. Samuel nodded, unable to speak. "His mother, she's gone," he finally whispered. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I lost my child 3 days ago," she said, clutching at her chest. "But she looked down, ashamed. "I still have milk. I can help him." For a long, aching moment, neither of them moved. The storm raged outside, the fire popped inside, and between them, life trembled in the small, hungry breaths of a child. Samuel's heart twisted. He felt guilt, relief, confusion, all tangled into one raw ache that burned hotter than the fire. He handed the baby to her, his hands shaking. The woman took him gently, as if holding something sacred. The baby whimpered, then latched, his cries fading into quiet, rhythmic breaths. Samuel turned away, tears blurring his vision. For the first time since Mary's passing, there was silence, not empty, not hollow, but full of something living. He knelt by the fire, his shoulders shaking, and the woman said nothing. She only rocked the baby, whispering soft words meant for her lost child, for his lost wife, for the small, fragile thread of life between them all. Hours passed like that. When the baby finally slept, the woman laid him in the cradle Samuel had carved with his own hands. She touched the edge of the wood, tracing the initials burned into it, MH, for Mary Holt. Her eyes softened. "You loved her deeply," she said quietly. Samuel nodded. "She was my heart." The woman smiled faintly. "Then you still have her. Right there." She looked toward the cradle. In him. The next morning, the storm had calmed. Snow lay heavy across the fields, untouched and glistening like forgiveness. Samuel fed the fire while the woman, her name was Clara, she said, tended to the baby. The ranch, once filled with silence and grief, now echoed with small sounds of life again. The soft coos of a child, the gentle hum of a woman's voice. Over the days that followed, Clara stayed. Samuel didn't ask her to, but he didn't ask her to leave either. She mended clothes, cooked when she could, and nursed the child as if he were her own. Yet every night, Samuel saw her step outside, standing beneath the vast, frozen sky, whispering something to the wind. Perhaps to her own lost child. perhaps to God. One night, as the fire burned low, Samuel found her sitting by the cradle, tears streaking her cheeks. "It's strange," she murmured. "I came here empty, but when I feed him, it feels like my heart remembers how to live." He knelt beside her, his hand trembling as it brushed against hers. "You saved him," he said, voice thick. "You saved me." She looked at him, her eyes shimmering with something that was not sorrow but not quite peace either. "Maybe he saved us both." Weeks turned to months. The snow melted, and spring crept slowly across the land. Samuel began to laugh again, sometimes quietly, as if afraid of the sound. Clara's presence filled the cabin with warmth that even fire couldn't give. The baby grew stronger, his cries turning into soft laughter that echoed through the walls. But in that laughter, Samuel sometimes heard echoes of Mary, and in Clara's touch, he felt the ache of something that both healed and hurt. Love, he realized, was not something that replaced what was lost. It was something that grew around the loss, like wildflowers over a grave. One morning, Clara packed her things. Samuel found her by the stable, the early sun brushing gold across her hair. "You're leaving?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I have to. There are others who need help, like you did." Samuel swallowed hard. "And what about us?" She smiled sadly. "You already have everything you need." She stepped closer, pressed her hand to his chest, right over his heart. "She's still here," she whispered. "And so am I, in a way." Then she kissed the baby's forehead, her tears falling on his skin like blessings, and walked away into the light of morning. Samuel stood there for a long time, the baby warm in his arms. The ranch was still, peaceful, alive again. The fire inside the cabin flickered steady, no longer just a light against the dark, but a reminder that even in the coldest storms, sometimes grace knocks softly on the door. The sun lingered low over the hills when Clara disappeared into the pale gold of morning, her figure growing smaller until the wind swallowed her outline. Samuel stood motionless at the gate, the baby nestled in his arms. The air carried her scent still, soap, hay, and something faintly sweet, like the wild lilacs that used to bloom behind the barn. For a long while, he simply listened to the rhythm of the baby's breathing, the steady heartbeat against his chest, and tried to convince himself she would come back. But she did not. The days that followed were heavy with silence. The world seemed to have fallen back into the quiet he had known after Mary's death, except now it was different. There was no sharp edge to this silence, no bitterness. It was gentler, though it ached no less. It was as if Clara had left behind an echo of herself that refused to fade. Samuel poured himself into the ranch. He mended fences, fed the livestock, and worked through the long hours with the baby strapped close to his chest in a sling Clara had sewn before she left. He spoke to the boy as he worked, not because the infant understood but because it filled the air with something other than loneliness. He named him Eli, after his father, a name Mary had chosen before she passed. Every evening, after the chores were done and the fire burned low, Samuel would sit by the cradle and tell Eli stories. About the wide plains, about his mother's laughter, about the woman who had appeared at their door when hope was nearly gone. Sometimes, he caught himself speaking to Clara instead, as if she were still there. He would look toward the empty chair by the fire and imagine her quiet smile, her hands folded in her lap. Winter loosened its hold, and the snow melted into streams that carved soft paths through the pasture. The land stirred with life again. Buds on the trees, calves finding their legs, the sky alive with birds returning home. Samuel found himself humming while he worked, a habit he hadn't had since before Mary's illness. There was peace in motion, a rhythm that carried him forward even when memories threatened to drag him back. But at night, when the wind rustled through the cracks in the cabin walls, he dreamed. He saw Clara standing by the cradle, her hand on Eli's chest, her eyes full of something unspoken. Sometimes, she smiled, sometimes, she wept, and every time, when he reached out to her, the dream faded, leaving only the smell of rain and the sound of a distant knock that never came. Miles away, Clara walked the winding roads between small towns, her body still weak from the winter but her spirit steadier than it had been in months. She found work where she could, helping birth calves on farms, tending to sick children, cooking for widowers too lost in their own sorrow to care for themselves. She did it not for coin, but because caring had become her way of breathing again. Yet no matter where she went, she thought of the ranch, the tiny cabin, the man with grief in his eyes, and the baby whose cry had first broken the silence in her heart. Some nights, she would wake with milk soaking her dress and tears on her cheeks, her body remembering a child that wasn't hers. She prayed then, quietly, fervently, that Samuel and Eli were safe, that the fire still burned in their home, that the man who had once stood in the dark doorway with a dying heart had learned to live again. Spring deepened into summer. Samuel built a new fence around the pasture, repaired the old barn roof, and planted a patch of wildflowers near the porch where Mary used to sit and hum. Eli learned to laugh, soft at first, then loud and bright, a sound that seemed to chase away the ghosts that clung to the walls. The ranch no longer felt like a tomb but a cradle of second chances. Still, Samuel's heart carried two absences. One was the ache of Mary, now softened into memory. The other was Clara, whose name he rarely spoke but whose presence he felt everywhere. He wondered where she had gone, whether she still walked beneath the same stars he looked up to every night, whether she had found peace or was still wandering the edges of the world searching for something to heal her pain. One evening, after putting Eli to bed, Samuel sat outside on the porch, watching the horizon burn orange with sunset. The breeze carried the scent of rain and something else, something familiar that stirred him. He closed his eyes and listened. For a moment, he could almost hear her voice. That night, he began to write. He wasn't a man of letters, but he poured his thoughts onto scraps of paper, about the land, about the child, about gratitude. He wrote about the knock that had saved them both, about the way her kindness had mended something inside him that he hadn't known was broken. He ended the letter with words simple and true. Greater than, if you ever find this, know that you are remembered not as a visitor, but as the breath that brought this house back to life. He sealed it in a tin box and buried it near the wildflowers, under the sycamore where Mary had once carved their initials. It wasn't meant to be found. It was a prayer, not a message. Years passed quietly. Eli grew strong, chasing the cattle through the meadows, his laughter echoing across the fields. Samuel grew older, the lines on his face deepening not with bitterness but with the weight of love lived fully and lost gently. He told Eli stories of Mary and of Clara, though he spoke of the latter as one speaks of a saint, someone who arrived when heaven still had mercy to spare. Meanwhile, Clara's hair began to gray at the edges. She had seen many roads, many faces. In each town, she left behind traces of healing, children saved from sickness, broken families mended by her touch. But her heart, though whole, carried a quiet emptiness that no word could fill. She had never remarried, though many asked. There was a stillness in her soul that belonged only to one place. One autumn, years later, Clara returned to the valley. The mountains rose familiar in the distance, and the air smelled of pine and memory. She had not planned it. Her feet had simply led her there, guided by something she couldn't name. When she reached the old ranch, she found it changed yet unchanged. The fence was stronger, the barn freshly painted, the fields alive with golden grain. She stood at the gate for a long time before she saw a man approaching, a tall figure with broad shoulders, his hair streaked with gray. For a heartbeat, she thought it was Samuel, but as he drew closer, she saw the youth in his face. It was Eli. Their eyes met, and something in her chest gave way. He looked so much like his father, yet there was a gentleness in his eyes that belonged only to him. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked politely, tipping his hat. Clara smiled, her hands trembling. "I once knew this place," she said softly. "A long time ago." Eli studied her face, something flickering in his expression. "You're her," he said suddenly, realization dawning. "You're the woman my father told me about." Clara's throat tightened. "And your father," she managed. Eli looked down, his smile tinged with sorrow. "He passed last winter, peacefully, in his sleep. He talked about you often toward the end." Clara pressed a hand to her heart. The world seemed to blur for a moment, the sky bending under the weight of memory. "He was a good man," she whispered. "The best," Eli said. "He used to say you were an angel sent by God himself. Said he never stopped thanking the Lord for that night you knocked on our door." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She looked toward the house. The door was still the same, the wood weathered, the latch polished by years of use. "May I?" she asked. Eli nodded. "Of course." Inside, everything breathed familiarity. The rocking chair by the fire. The cradle, now tucked against the wall, still carved with the initials MH. The smell of pine resin and smoke. She ran her fingers over the mantle and felt the years collapse around her. Eli handed her something. A small tin box, worn but carefully kept. "He wanted you to have this," he said. "Said if you ever came back, this belonged to you." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was the letter, yellowed with time, and a lock of baby hair tied with a faded blue ribbon. She unfolded the paper, her eyes tracing the familiar, uneven scrawl. As she read Samuel's words, the cabin seemed to fill again with the warmth of that winter, the fire, the crying. "Baby," the sound of her own voice humming a lullaby into the storm. When she reached the last line, tears fell freely, but they were not the tears of sorrow. They were the quiet tears of something that had finally found its way home. Eli stood beside her silently. When she finished reading, she placed the letter back in the box and held it to her chest. "He was never alone," she said softly. "Even when I wasn't here." Eli nodded. "He said the same about you." Clara stayed for a few days, helping Eli with the harvest, cooking meals, and telling stories by the fire. She slept in the small room where Mary had once kept her sewing, waking each morning to the sound of roosters and the golden sweep of dawn across the hills. Every corner of the ranch breathed Samuel's memory, not as grief, but as love made permanent. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Clara walked to the sycamore tree. The wildflowers still bloomed there, stubborn and bright against the fading light. She knelt, pressing her fingers into the soil, and felt something, an old, quiet hum, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I came back." The wind stirred through the branches, soft and familiar, and for a moment she thought she heard his voice, the same deep, steady tone that had once spoken her name in gratitude and wonder. When she rose, she saw Eli standing a few paces behind her, watching silently. "You'll keep it alive," she said to him. "I will," he promised. She smiled. "Then my heart can rest." That night, as she lay in the small bed, Clara dreamed, not of sorrow, but of light. She saw Mary standing beside Samuel beneath the sycamore, both of them smiling, their hands clasped. Behind them, the baby she had once fed, now grown into a man, stood with a gentle smile. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The dream was peace. When morning came, the sky was washed in gold. Eli found her sitting on the porch, her eyes closed, the letter resting in her lap. The dawn light touched her face with the gentleness of a benediction. She looked up at him and smiled. "I think it's time I moved on," she said. "There are still people out there who need what I have left to give." Eli didn't try to stop her. He understood. Some souls were meant to wander so that others could stay rooted. As she rode away down the familiar road, the ranch faded slowly behind her. The mountains glowed in the morning sun, and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers. She didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't have to. She carried the memory with her, not as a wound but as a light that would never dim. Samuel's kindness, Mary's love, and the laughter of a child, they had become her compass, guiding her wherever mercy was needed. And somewhere beyond the horizon, where the earth meets the sky, she felt it again, that quiet knock upon her heart, reminding her that love, once given freely, never truly leaves. The road stretched endlessly before Clara, a ribbon of dust and gold winding between the hills. Behind her, the ranch was only a faint mark on the horizon, a whisper of smoke. She didn't look back. She had promised herself not to. Not because she wanted to forget, but because she needed to carry it forward, not drag it behind. Every turn of the road seemed to breathe Samuel's name. Every gust of wind carried the faint laughter of the boy she had once cradled. Her horse's steady rhythm became her heartbeat. With each mile, the world widened, but her heart remained tethered to that small cabin and the people who had filled it with meaning. Grief, she had learned long ago, never leaves completely. It only changes its shape, from the kind that crushes, to the kind that humbles. Clara passed through small towns that seemed to have been forgotten by time. She offered her help quietly, as she always had. A fevered child here, an old man there, a birth that came too early or a wound that needed tending, she gave herself to each moment without question. People came to know her not by name, but by presence. The kind woman with eyes like rain, they called her. Years unfolded this way, quietly and without fanfare. Seasons turned, each one carrying a shade of memory that found its place in her heart. When she looked up at the stars at night, she would sometimes whisper a name, not out of longing, but gratitude. Samuel, Mary, Eli. One autumn, as the leaves turned amber and the fields lay bare, Clara settled for a time in a town by the river. There was an old chapel there, small and in need of care. The priest, a kindly man whose hands trembled with age, welcomed her help. She mended the roof, washed the altar cloths, and planted flowers in the small graveyard behind the church. Children followed her around, curious about the quiet woman who always smiled but rarely spoke of herself. Among them was a little girl named June. She reminded Clara of Eli, the same curious eyes, the same easy laughter. June's mother was ill, bedridden with a sickness that stole her breath day by day. Clara took it upon herself to care for her, bringing soups, washing linens, sitting by her bedside when the nights grew long. When the woman passed, Clara stayed with June, holding her as she wept. "You're not alone," she told her gently, stroking the child's hair. "Someone once told me the same thing when I thought I'd lost everything." The words came from a place deep within her, a memory of a man standing in a doorway, holding a crying baby, lost between hope and despair. It was strange how life repeated itself in softer echoes. Clara stayed with June until she was grown, teaching her to read, to tend the garden, to pray with her hands as much as with her heart. She watched her grow into a woman full of grace and laughter, and when June married and moved to a nearby farm, Clara packed her few belongings and continued on. She left no note, only a pressed wildflower on the table and a single line written beneath it, "Carry kindness with you." It's the only thing that never fades. The years that followed were gentler, though her body grew frailer. She traveled slower, her steps careful, but her heart remained steady. Wherever she went, people remembered her, not as someone extraordinary, but as someone who had listened, truly listened, when the world seemed too loud. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Eli's life blossomed in the rhythm of the land. He married a woman named Lila, a teacher who had come from the city. Together, they built a life steeped in the same quiet love that had once filled those walls. The house changed. New paint, new laughter, but the soul of it remained the same. Eli often spoke of his father, and sometimes of Clara. On quiet nights, he'd sit by the fire with his wife and tell their children the story of the woman who had appeared during a snowstorm and saved him when he was too young to remember. Lila would listen, eyes wide, her hands folded around a cup of tea. "She sounds like an angel," she'd say softly. "She was," Eli would reply. "But more than that, she was human. And that's what made her beautiful." In the spring of his 41st year, Eli discovered a letter tucked inside an old Bible that had belonged to his father. The handwriting was Samuel's, and though the ink was faded, the words still carried the weight of his soul. "Greater than, if ever I'm gone and she returns, tell her this, she gave more than life that winter. She gave me the courage to keep living when love felt like a wound too deep to heal. And if she never returns, then let her memory live in the laughter of the boy she saved. That will be enough." Eli read the letter aloud to his wife, his voice breaking halfway through. He loved her, he whispered. Lila nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Love doesn't end, Eli. It just changes form." That night, Eli dreamed of a woman walking along a dusty road beneath a sky full of stars, her gray hair shining like silver threads of moonlight. When he woke, he felt an unexplainable peace, as though some distant part of his father's story had quietly found its ending. Far away, Clara had grown old. Her hands, once steady and strong, now trembled when she poured tea. Her hair had turned white, soft as snow. She had settled near the sea, where the wind smelled of salt and thyme. She rented a small room above a bakery, where every morning the smell of fresh bread greeted her like an old friend. The baker's wife, a kind woman named Marta, took to visiting her in the evenings. They would sit by the window and talk about simple things, the tides, the gulls, the fishermen who sang as they worked. Marta often asked about Clara's past, but Clara always smiled and said, "I have loved and I have lost, and both have been blessings." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marta asked softly, "Do you ever miss the people you left behind?" Clara looked toward the sea, its endless motion mirroring her thoughts. I don't think we ever truly leave the ones we love, she said. We carry them in the quiet places, in the way we breathe, the way we forgive, the way we remember. As night fell, she felt the familiar pull in her chest, that ache that wasn't pain, but presence. She reached for her satchel, where she kept Samuel's old letter, now worn and fragile. She unfolded it, tracing the words with her finger, and whispered into the wind, "You kept your promise. You lived, and that's all I ever wanted." Days grew slower, softer. Clara spent her mornings tending the small garden behind the bakery, growing herbs and flowers that she would give to strangers. The children of the village loved her. They would bring her shells and stories, and she would listen with the same warmth she had once given to a crying baby long ago. One day, a traveler came through the village, a tall man with a kind smile and curious eyes. He stopped at the bakery for bread and struck up a conversation with Marta. When Clara entered, he turned and froze, a strange recognition flickering across his face. "Are you Clara Holt?" he asked hesitantly. She blinked. "I haven't heard that name in years." "Yes, I am." The man's expression softened. "My name's Thomas Holt. Eli was my grandfather." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for a chair. "Eli," she whispered, "so he lived a good life." Thomas smiled, his eyes bright. "The best. He used to tell stories about you, about the woman who saved him and his father. He said you were family, even if you weren't bound by blood." Tears welled in her eyes. "Family," she repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose that's what we were." Thomas stayed for hours, telling her about the ranch, how it still stood, how wildflowers still grew beneath the sycamore tree, how his mother kept the old cradle in the attic as a reminder of where it all began. Clara listened, her heart swelling with every word. Before he left, Thomas handed her a small wooden carving. It was of a bird, simple and rough, but familiar. "Grandfather made this for you," he said. "He always said you'd come back one day, even if it took generations." Clara held the carving to her chest, her tears falling silently. "Tell them," she said softly, "that I carried them with me every step of the way." That night, Clara placed the carving on her windowsill. The moonlight fell across it gently, and for the first time in years, she felt completely at peace. The sea murmured outside, the wind whispering through the open window, and she thought she could hear distant laughter, a man, a woman, and a child. When morning came, the sun rose soft and golden over the water. Marta found Clara sitting in her chair by the window, the bird carving still in her hands, a faint smile on her lips. She was gone, but the room felt alive with warmth, as if she had simply stepped into the next room, leaving behind the echo of a life fully lived. Word of her passing spread through the town, and people came from miles around to lay flowers in the garden she had tended. The baker's wife planted wildflowers by the sea in her memory, the same kind that grew beneath the sycamore tree. Months later, Thomas returned to the ranch, carrying Clara's belongings, the letter, the carving, and a pouch of dried wildflower seeds. He buried them beneath the sycamore, beside the spot where Samuel's letter had once been found. The wind rustled the leaves above him, and he looked up, feeling the weight of generations settling into harmony. Eli's children stood beside him, watching. One of them, a little girl with bright, curious eyes, tugged at his sleeve. "Who was she, Papa?" she asked. Thomas smiled down at her. "She was the woman who taught our family what love really means. Not the kind that ends, but the kind that keeps the world turning." And as the evening light bathed the fields in gold, the first wildflowers began to bloom. They said later that spring came early that year, and that the air around the old ranch always smelled faintly of lilac and rain. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers through the open fields that spring, sweeping across the ranch like a breath from the past. It brushed against the sycamore tree, its great branches whispering softly, as if telling stories to the earth below. Thomas often came there at dusk, when the sky turned molten gold, and sat beside the place where Clara's seeds had taken root. He could almost feel her there, not as a ghost, but as something deeper. Presence, not absence. Life on the ranch had changed over the generations, yet its heartbeat remained steady. The barns were newer, the fences stronger, but the soul of the land was still shaped by the hands that had once struggled to keep it alive. It was a place built not just on soil and sweat, but on mercy, the kind that passed quietly from one heart to another. Thomas's daughter, Amelia, loved to play beneath the sycamore. She would gather the fallen leaves and braid them into crowns, pretending the tree was enchanted. Sometimes she'd look up and ask, "Papa, who planted the flowers here?" And Thomas would smile, his gaze soft. "Someone who believed love doesn't end when people leave," he'd say. "It just changes shape." He told her stories about the rancher who had once lived here, the woman who had come during the storm, and the baby who had grown to be a man. Each retelling carried a new depth, as though time itself kept adding to the tale. Amelia would listen wide-eyed, clutching the hem of his coat, her imagination painting vivid pictures of snow-covered nights and gentle voices. Years rolled on. The ranch thrived, and so did the family. But time, as it always does, began to weave its slow tapestry of change. Thomas grew older, his hair silvered, his back stooped from years of labor. The seasons marked him, yet he carried his years with quiet pride. He often said he didn't just work the land, he listened to it. One winter, after a storm much like the one that had once changed Samuel's life, Thomas walked out to the sycamore with a lantern. Snow blanketed the world in silence, and the stars shimmered faintly above. He brushed the snow away from the flowers that somehow still clung to life beneath the tree's roots. Kneeling there, he felt the weight of generations pressing gently on his shoulders, not heavy, but grounding. He spoke softly into the cold air. "If you're out there, Clara, Samuel, Mary, thank you. For the mercy you gave, for the life you started here." The lantern flickered, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement, a soft shimmer of light among the branches, like fireflies dancing in the snow. It faded quickly, leaving only stillness, but he felt something warm bloom in his chest. Some stories, he thought, never really end. They just keep breathing through those who remember. When spring came again, Thomas's health began to fail. The doctor from town said it was simply age, the body, tired from years of work, ready to rest. But Thomas wasn't afraid. Each evening, he sat by the fire, his grandchildren gathered at his feet, and told the stories again. He spoke of courage, of loss, of the grace that had once walked through their door unannounced. "Always open your heart," he told them. "You never know when kindness will come knocking." Amelia, now a young woman, listened more closely than the others. Something in her spirit seemed to echo the quiet strength of Clara, that calm, steady light that could soften even the hardest sorrow. She had her great-great-grandfather's eyes, that same deep steadiness that looked not at the world, but into it. When Thomas passed, it was peaceful. The family found him in his chair by the fire, the last embers glowing, his hand resting on the Bible that had belonged to Samuel. He had been writing a letter addressed simply to whoever finds this next. Greater than, "I have lived with ghosts, but not the kind that haunt. The kind that remind." This ranch was built by love that refused to die, by mercy that arrived when it was least expected. If you ever wonder what keeps this land alive, it isn't the fences or the cattle. It's the kindness that was sown here long ago. Keep it alive, pass it on. The letter was placed in the family chest, beside Samuel's, Clara's bird carving, and the lock of baby hair tied in blue ribbon. It became tradition that every generation would add one letter to the box, not of instruction, but of gratitude. Years drifted onward like clouds. The ranch passed into Amelia's care. She married a quiet man named David, who loved the open fields as much as she did. Together, they raised 3 children and rebuilt the barn that had nearly collapsed during a thunderstorm. Life, as it always did here, continued in cycles of loss and renewal. But one year, a terrible drought came. The earth cracked under the sun's relentless gaze, and the cattle grew thin. Wells dried up, and hope began to waver. Amelia tried to stay strong, remembering her father's words, but the nights grew long, and doubt crept in. One evening, as she sat beneath the sycamore tree, her youngest child asleep in her lap, she whispered, "What do I do? How do I keep them safe?" The air was still, not a breeze stirred. Then, softly, a single leaf drifted down from the branches and landed beside her. She picked it up and turned it over in her hand. On its surface, veins traced patterns like words, fragile, yet certain. She smiled through her tears. "All right," she whispered. "I'll try again." The next morning, she gathered her family and began digging a new well near the old creek bed. It was back-breaking work, but she refused to stop. On the third day, as the sun rose over the hills, the shovel struck something hard, a buried spring. Water, cold and pure, burst forth, soaking the earth beneath their feet. Amelia fell to her knees, laughing and weeping all at once. "Thank you," she whispered to the air, to the roots, to the invisible hands that had always guided this place. The drought broke soon after. Rain returned, slow and steady, and the ranch came alive again. People in nearby towns called it luck, but Amelia knew better. Some blessings, she thought, or simply old promises keeping themselves. In the years that followed, she expanded the ranch, built a schoolhouse for the children of nearby families, and turned the old cabin into a place of rest for travelers, especially those with no one to welcome them. She called it the Haven. Every stranger who came through its door was fed, warmed, and given a bed for the night, no questions asked. On the mantel, above the fire, hung three things: Samuel's carving knife, Clara's bird, and a simple wooden sign burned with the words, "Kindness lives here." One winter, a traveler arrived late at night, a woman alone, shivering, clutching a bundle wrapped in cloth. Amelia opened the door without hesitation. "Come in," she said. "You're safe here." The woman stepped inside, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. She looked young, no older than 20, and the child in her arms whimpered softly. Amelia took her coat, guided her to the fire, and offered soup. "Thank you," the woman whispered. "We've been walking for days." Amelia smiled gently. "You're not the first to find this place in need," she said. "And you won't be the last." As the woman fed her baby, Amelia felt a strange warmth fill her chest, a deep, wordless knowing. The scene before her was a mirror of the one that had begun this story generations ago. A crying child, a storm outside, a door opened by grace. That night, as the fire burned low, Amelia sat by the cradle and wrote in her journal, "Greater than, kindness has a way of coming back, like the tide. What began with one act of mercy continues to ripple through time. Perhaps love is not something we keep. Perhaps it's something we hand forward, again and again." The years flowed quietly after that. The ranch became a sanctuary, not only for family but for strangers who carried their own storms. The story of the woman in the snow became legend in the valley, told by grandmothers beside the fire and by children under starlit skies. Decades later, when Amelia was old and her hair had turned to silver, she walked one last time to the sycamore. The tree had grown vast, its branches stretching wide over the wildflowers. She could feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath her feet, steady and familiar. She carried the family chest with her, the one that held all the letters, the carving, and the fragments of their shared past. With careful hands, she placed it at the base of the tree and whispered, "It's all here. Everything you began." The wind stirred, and for a moment, she thought she heard voices, laughter, the soft murmur of gratitude, the hum of lullabies long faded. She smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. "We did well, didn't we?" That night, Amelia passed peacefully in her sleep. The next morning, her family found her journal open beside her bed. The last line read, "Greater than, the door you open for one soul may end up saving 100 more. Never close it." Her children buried her beneath the sycamore, beside the chest. As seasons passed, the tree's roots grew around it, entwining memory and earth until they were one. The ranch continued on, as it always had, not untouched by sorrow, but carried by love stronger than time. Generations came and went, roads were built, fences changed, and the world beyond the valley grew loud with machines and progress. Yet here, in this quiet place, something sacred endured. Travelers still stopped at the haven, still found warmth and rest, still asked about the story of the rancher and the woman in the storm. And those who stayed long enough swore that, on cold nights when the wind howled and the snow began to fall, you could see light in the old cabin's window, and if you listened closely, the faint sound of a baby's laugh, followed by a woman's soft lullaby and a man's deep voice humming along. No one ever proved it, and no one tried to. Some truths, after all, don't need proving. They simply need remembering. In the end, the story that began with grief became one of generations, of people who learned that love, once planted, does not die with the body that gave it. It grows. It takes root in the soil, in the hands of those who tend it, in the hearts of strangers who find shelter in its shade. And so, the ranch stood, not as a monument to what was lost, but as a living testament to what was found. Mercy, given once, living forever. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.